The 2025 Formula One season is upon us, so I'm going to put forward one thing that each of the 10 teams desperately needs to change. The one thing that will help Carlos Sainz thrive at Williams, a change that will help Max Verstappen back to dominance, and the thing that will lead to McLaren winning the Drivers' World Championship. Although it's not going to be easy because the 2025 season is in an awkward spot for a lot of these teams. The huge 2026 overhaul to the regulations will be finalized this month, meaning that the teams do have to make a decision. Do they completely give up on 2025 and accept that this will be a really tough year and try and capitalize on getting ahead for 2026? Or do they spend this time developing throughout 2025 to make this season's car the best that it can be? In the case of Aston, RB, Haas and Alpine, understanding their weaknesses better could help them finally get to grips with this regulation cycle and grab some extra prize money over the midfield pack, which they can use next year. Whilst for teams like McLaren and Ferrari, this might be their one real shot at a driver's title. But if they focus too much on this year, does that open the door to Mercedes and Red Bull starting 2026 back at the top? It's a real double-edged sword, and it's going to be such a difficult season for the teams to balance effectively. Add on to that how competitive the end of last season was, and this season is poised to be one of the best that we have ever seen. That is, unless you're a Sauber fan. I suppose you can get excited about the prospect of seeing Nico Hülkenberg and Gabriel Bortoleto joining the team, with the latter coming off the back of winning Formula 2, but after a season where they were the 10th fastest team outside of maybe the first few races by a considerable distance to the rest, there doesn't seem much of a way of them getting back into contention for 2025 outside of building a brand new car. With one season of these regulations to run and a rebrand into Audi only a season away, that doesn't seem likely. On the one hand, that does give them an excuse. They can say that they're just using this season to prepare the team before it becomes the Audi Works team. But on the other hand, another season of being miles off the pace is going to start raising some eyebrows at Audi. The Audi project already seems to be on a knife edge. The team has had multiple changes to key personnel, been partially sold to Qatari investors, and has already backtracked on its goal to win races by 2028, and we haven't even seen them out on track yet. The one change that the Sauber team really needs to make for 2025 isn't dependent on Sauber at all, really. The Audi higher-ups need to decide how they want this team to be set up, pick a direction and stick with it. They have a lot of catching up to do and a lot that needs to be learned in a very short period of time. So they really need to just stop changing their minds so that the team can have a stable foundation to work from for 2026. They could actually do with learning a little bit from Williams in that respect, who seem like they have that stability now in place. A figurehead in James Vowles who's level-headed about his expectations, along with arguably one of the best driver pairings on the grid in Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz, although last season did see them drift away from the rest of the midfield pack as the season progressed. This season should be better. They compromised the start of their 2024 season so they could completely rework their production process. It did mean that they had staff sleeping in the factory to get their cars finished for Bahrain testing, but you only have to go through that annoyance once. And now that those changes have been made, they should hopefully see the benefits. However, the real thing that cost the team last year, actually in more ways than one, was the huge number of crashes that they had. Of course, all teams have crashes to contend with, but Williams didn't just have a little bump here and there. Albon, Sargent and Colapinto all decided to completely write off a chassis or two, and it does concern me that everyone who seemed to be put in a Williams last season had their meetings with the barriers. It points towards there being something fairly wrong with the car's balance, but you could tell that those crashes led to the team just being exhausted. The car for the final few races was put together with super glue and whatever spares they could find lying around the garage, and performance didn't matter at all. It was just about getting the car out on track so the sponsors could see that it was there. So one thing I would be addressing if I was Williams is reducing that repair bill. If the car really is that difficult to control, especially at high speeds, that's something that needs to be addressed quickly, even if it does cost them a little bit of performance, especially with 2026 around the corner. Basically, their goal for 2025 is to finish more races than they did in 2024. When it comes to RB, I do this video every year, and it feels like I'm always saying the same thing about the Red Bull sister team. There are periods of the season where they look like the best midfield car, and they were right in the battle for finishing 6th in the Constructors' Championship last year, only to finish a fairly distant 8th place, because let's face it, going into the final race, although yes, they could have still technically managed 6th place in the championship, it was never going to happen outside of an absolutely crazy Abu Dhabi Grand Prix where Haas and Alpine would have had to have imploded. Of course, they were once again impacted by the Red Bull higher-ups not knowing which drivers they wanted in which seats. The year before, we saw Nick de Vries being replaced mid-season with Daniel Ricciardo, and then last year we saw another mid-season swap, this time Daniel Ricciardo being replaced by Liam Lawson. And you know what? Next year, would it be that insane to predict that they might replace Liam Lawson if he doesn't do what they're hoping in the main team, or Isaac Hadjar if he doesn't hit the ground running at RB, and suddenly they're throwing like a Lindblad in out of nowhere? This is Red Bull we're talking about. Anything could happen. But that's something that's out of their hands and something we might talk about a little bit later when we get to the main team. Something that the RB team don't do, which I think they could be doing a lot more of, is aligning themselves with the main Red Bull team in terms of their car design. Now, I'm not talking about copying. I know that the RB team like to see themselves as a separate team to the Red Bull team, outside of the crazy driver situations, and I'm not saying I want to see another pink Mercedes style situation either. But there are some core concepts that can be shared between the two teams legally inside of the regulations, which would benefit RB and also benefit Red Bull. From RB's perspective, you're getting a car which is much more competitive and therefore leading to you getting more points and more prize money, which you can use to then continue to improve. Whilst from Red Bull's perspective, you're putting your junior drivers in a car which is much more similar to the car that you're hoping they're going to step up into in the main team. So the data that you gain from the sister team in terms of the driver's ability to adapt to the car and the pace that they show in races and qualifying is way more useful in understanding if they're ready to step up. It just seems like a really obvious thing for both teams to be doing that they never seem to be doing. I have nothing but praise for what Haas managed to achieve during the 2024 season. At the start of 2024, I gave them the goal of trying to find a little bit of consistency throughout the season, rather than starting really well and then drifting off and becoming the slowest team by the end of the year, and they managed to do that. The team consistently scored points throughout the entirety of 2024, even managing to address the issues that they had of destroying tyres and bringing an upgrade package to Austin, which actually made the car quicker during the season, something that the Haas team have really struggled with in the past. And then I said alongside that, if they could find a little bit of investment so they aren't clearly the smallest team on the Formula One grid anymore and can align themselves with teams like Williams and RB, that would be a bonus. And they managed to achieve that too, bringing in Toyota as a partner who can offer them their own wind tunnel and their own simulator so they don't have to keep borrowing from Ferrari anymore, is an absolute dream scenario for the Haas team. In fact, if they hadn't have just missed out on 6th place in the Constructors' Championship, I would say that 2024 is as close to a perfect season for the Haas team's development as they could have possibly asked for. Which begs the question, what can they do this year to continue that upward trajectory? And the only glaring difference between Haas last year and Haas this year is that they didn't manage to keep hold of Nico Hülkenberg. He was so good for the Haas team last year. I don't think it's too controversial to say that he was one of the top 5 drivers on the grid, but Haas just don't have the finances and the pulling power of a brand like Audi, especially to a German driver. So you can completely understand why Nico wanted to make that switch. I do like the direction that the Haas team have gone in. I think Ocon is a great safe pair of hands for a midfield team, and Ollie Bearman is a really exciting young talent. If both hit the ground running, they could have a very solid driver pairing on their hands. But I would love to see them lock in that driver pairing long term and decide who's going to be the spearhead for the team going into the new regulations in 2026. Of course, they have the issue of Ollie Bearman still being a Ferrari driver. If something did happen to Charles Leclerc or Lewis Hamilton, he'd be taken away from Haas pretty quickly, I imagine. But if they could come to some kind of agreement where they guarantee Bearman in that Haas seat for a few seasons, similar to when Williams managed to lock down George Russell for a few seasons, I think it would really benefit their progression. They've had so many ins and outs over the last few years that having a driver pair which is competitive and constant for 3 3 or 4 years would be brilliant for them. And similar could be said for Alpine, to be honest, although it's not just the drivers that have been through the revolving door at the French team. I know that as I'm recording this, we still haven't got full confirmation on the whole Doohan Colapinto saga. I feel like that's going to go well into the season. And I do have an underlying feeling that Jack will be replaced at some point during the 2025 season. It's harsh, it really is, but I can also understand why the team would make that decision. However, back to the point of this video, that has to be the final chaotic change of key personnel. They've done it all now. They've changed the team principal, they've changed the CEO, they've brought in David Sanchez as the technical director to change the development philosophy, and hopefully soon they'll have sorted out both of their drivers for the foreseeable future. They've even dropped out of being an engine manufacturer for the 2026 season and beyond. It feels like everything that they could have possibly changed, they have now managed to change. So let's just stick with something. I don't mean that I want to see another 100 race plan where they say they're going to go from middle of the pack to winning the championships and destroying records in 100 races time, because that just isn't realistic, and it didn't work the first time. I remember Otmar said, you can't get 9 women pregnant and hope to have a baby in a month, when he was discussing how the team approached their desire to win. Alpine always seems to throw loads of different things at their Formula One setup in hopes of a quick fix, but Formula One doesn't work like that, and hopefully they've learned that Formula One doesn't work like that. You can't say that you're going to be winning races in 100 Grand Prix time, because you should be adapting to each hurdle as it comes, rather than panicking because you've set yourself this impossible deadline. What I'd like to see is everybody who's now come in amongst the myriad of changes at Alpine actually given some time to show what they can do, meaning the one change I'd like to see at Alpine, and the one change that I think will help them the most, is making no changes at all. Now we're getting up towards the juicy end of the grid. Aston Martin, the 5th best team in 2025, miles ahead of the rest of the teams that we've talked about in this video, but also miles behind the top 4 teams, ending up 374 points behind Mercedes. And the problem is, at the end of last year, it looked a lot more likely that they're going to be reeled in by the teams behind them in 2025 than anywhere close to the teams that finished ahead of them. You only have to look at Fernando Alonso's form throughout the year to track the peaks and troughs that the team went through, and you know that you've got an issue when even Alonso, a driver that makes everything look quick and someone who loves racing, goes into the final part of the season just wishing for the season to end. But he found a little optimism when the season did finish, saying, now I think we can reset, we can learn from all the difficulties and mistakes of this year and apply those learnings. You need to find that sweet spot in the car. You need to find that upgrade that really awakens everything in these ground effect cars. And if any team needs an upgrade to go right in 2025, it's Aston Martin. In both 2023 when they picked up podiums and in 2024 when they were on par with Mercedes, the Aston Martin team start the year really well. But as the season progresses and other teams start to bring their upgrade packages, they get closer and closer to the starting pace of the Aston Martin, or even above the team in green, and Aston Martin just can't seem to match that same level of progression. Every upgrade that the Aston Martin team brings either feels like a downgrade or leaves them with very similar pace to what they had before that upgrade anyway. However, if there is one team on the grid that should be thinking about 2026 more than 2025, it's probably Aston Martin. Their new factory is finally finished, their new wind tunnel is up and running, and they've managed to snag Adrian Newey and put him in that wind tunnel, which is why I really struggle to pinpoint one thing for Aston Martin to work on in 2025, outside of just getting an upgrade that works. It's basically a year of turning up, taking part, and waiting for 2026 to roll around. So I settled on the one thing that they need to replace, being Lance Stroll. Mercedes were definitely the most unpredictable team throughout the entirety of last season, so pinpointing one thing that they need to improve upon for next season is a pretty difficult task that I've set myself. If Mercedes could somehow convince the Formula One higher-ups that races can only take place in cold conditions, that would be amazing for their 2025 championship prospects. I don't think that's likely to happen though, and that means I can't see Mercedes being anything other than the 4th or maybe 3rd quickest car, with those one-off weekends where they're by far the quickest once again, for reasons that the team itself can't even explain. The gap that kind of form left them with last year in terms of the Constructors' Championship to the other top 4 teams just seems like too big of a gap to bridge within the upcoming season. So similar to what I said with Aston Martin, the focus for the Mercedes team this season probably shouldn't be 2025, but instead 2026. George Russell has showed last season that he's now more than capable of picking up results on the odd occasions where the car was quick, and he's getting closer to being the full Hamilton replacement that the Mercedes team need him to be if they do produce a championship contending car in the future. So I think they can rely on him to bring home enough points to make their season comfortable, whilst also bedding in Kimi Antonelli, who's been fast-tracked into Formula One. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. Max Verstappen also skipped steps along the ladder when he came onto the Formula One grid, and that's worked out pretty well for Red Bull in the long run. But unlike Verstappen, Kimi isn't going to have a season in the sister team where the pressure is lower. He's being thrown straight into the full Mercedes setup where he's going to be expected to perform. And I think that it's going to be really tough on him and that Antonelli is going to need a few races, if not the whole season, to get up to speed with everything. Putting all of those reasons together, the thing that I think Mercedes needs to focus on most this season is their driver lineup after the loss of Lewis Hamilton. We need to see George Russell's Mercedes team. He needs to step up another level again this year to prove that he can lead the team moving forwards. And if the team realizes that George isn't going to be their next world champion, they need to make sure that Kimi Antonelli is. And whilst we're talking about championships, it was another year, another Drivers' Championship for Max Verstappen, making it 4 in a row for the Dutchman, but all the way down in third when it came to the Constructors' Championship, just goes to show how far the Red Bull did fall as the season progressed. Verstappen's championship win came down to the rest of the pack starting the season slowly, along with Verstappen papering over the car's lack of pace with his own impressive driving. But I don't think they can get away with that again this year. They have managed to deal with the Sergio Perez problem. Unfortunately for the Mexican, when Verstappen was still capable of pulling out wins and podiums despite having the third or even fourth fastest car weekend to weekend, it makes your qualifying outside of the top 10 and finishing 7th or 8th look even worse than it actually is. And I do feel sorry for Sergio because he did take a lot of the blame for the team dropping down the constructors' order when it's now clear that somewhere between the 2023 domination season and the start of 2024, the team did go down the wrong development path. The car slowly dropped from being the fastest for the first 5 or 6 races to then being on par with McLaren to then behind McLaren, and by the end of the season, quite a bit off Ferrari too. And that doesn't happen without a real mistake being made somewhere in the development, which means I think Red Bull are maybe in the most uncomfortable spot going into 2025. Mercedes, as we said before, were so inconsistent that they can kind of get away with saying that 2025 is a little bit of a lost cause and that they're focusing on 2026. And the two teams that we haven't talked about yet have a real shot at making history in 2025, with Ferrari and McLaren not having won a Drivers' Championship in almost 2 decades. However, Red Bull weren't so far adrift that Verstappen couldn't be in the title fight conversation again this year if they really went for it. Also, they're not desperately in need of a championship win like the other two teams maybe are. So do they just throw away 2025 and try and dominate the next regulation cycle as they have dominated this one? It's a tough call to make, and it might be even tougher to do without Adrian Newey. Which leads me to what Red Bull really need to fix. The performance issues come second to the thing that I think Red Bull need to spend the most time on this year, and that's sorting out their internal warfare and the toxicity between Verstappen and Marko and the Austrian side of the team versus Horner and the Thai side of the team. Last season, they lost a lot of senior staff members in very influential positions after numerous negative press stories, including some very serious allegations thrown at Christian Horner at the start of last year, leaving the team to replace Adrian Newey, Jonathan Wheatley, Will Courtney, Rob Marshall, Lee Stevenson, and probably more who I'm forgetting. That's a lot of staff members who have been at the team for a very long time, which means getting in replacements and giving them time to learn needs to be the priority this season, and it's not going to be easy for them if the team is still as divided as it was in 2024. Then we come to Ferrari, who can feel pretty hard done by for what happened last season, where McLaren picked up the Constructors and Red Bull picked up the Drivers' Championship. You could argue that Ferrari should have been in the mix for both. I know I've shown this graphic in previous videos, but it staggers me how consistent Charles Leclerc was throughout the season. He finished in the top 5 in 21 out of the 24 races, and was on the podium 13 times. Had he not had that tough spell in the middle of the year, Charles would have likely been the driver we were talking about when it came to possibly catching Max Verstappen towards the end of the season, and even if he didn't catch Verstappen, he would have finished ahead of of Lando Norris in the standings, and Ferrari would have come top of the constructors because Carlos didn't have too bad of a season either. Ferrari are clearly a team that are on the up, and outside of that development blip with the floor, which they then rectified in Monza anyway, they have to be one of the favourites for both championships going into the 2025 season, especially with the fact that I think they've got the best driver pairing on the Formula One grid. They already had the raw talent of Charles Leclerc, who is by far and away the fastest driver in terms of one-lap pace in my opinion, and only getting better with each season that he has in the sport, now alongside the most decorated driver in Formula One history in Lewis Hamilton, who will bring so much experience and knowledge on how to win championships. Although that could end up being the source of Ferrari's biggest headaches throughout this 2025 campaign. As much as I've just praised Ferrari for their improvements throughout the entire year in various different departments, there is one thing that just doesn't seem to be improving as rapidly as everything else, and that's their strategy calls. There were many weekends where both Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz were on the radio throughout qualifying or the Grand Prix, questioning the team's decisions and sometimes even just going against what the team asked them to do because inside the car they could see that that strategy wasn't going to work, which then led to quite a few occasions where Charles and Carlos found themselves on the same piece of track and were sort of stumbling over one another, then leading to both of the drivers being unhappy. With Lewis Hamilton coming in, I think this is something that the team need to address from race one, because I do think Hamilton will eventually be closer to Leclerc than Carlos was last year, and Ferrari can't find themselves in a situation where they're costing each other and the team points. I don't know how they'll go about doing this, because I don't think either of them will want to play the second driver, and I don't think the team will want to have an out-and-out number one either, which does make it more difficult, as we saw with the McLaren team last year. Leclerc has been their driver for years now. He's basically Mr. Ferrari, but at the same time, Hamilton has come in on huge money with the goal of getting that 8th world title and becoming the greatest Formula One driver of all time outright. And if Ferrari can be the team that can help him do that, that would be a huge thing for them. So I don't know how they're actually going to end up making these decisions, but what I do know is they need to be a lot more cool, calm and collected over the radio than they were last year. Which brings us to McLaren, and if you look at where McLaren have come over the last 2 seasons, starting 2023 as the slowest car on the Formula One grid and going on to win the Constructors' Championship at the end of 2024, you could rightly argue that there's probably not too much that they need to put right. The progress that the team has made has been incredible. I mean, after that Miami upgrade, they weren't just troubling the big 3 teams, but they were often the team to beat. And although they weren't absolutely dominant every single weekend, with Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull still having weekends where they were the quickest car, when you look at the final 3 quarters of the season, overall, McLaren found themselves as the most consistently quick and the most adaptable to the conditions of each track. However, I do think there were a couple of things that came up throughout the 2024 season which need to be addressed going into 2025. The one that grabbed the headlines a lot towards the middle of the season was, of course, the papaya rules, and with Lando Norris trying to prove himself as a real title challenger for the first time in his career, whilst Oscar Piastri was still battling to establish himself as a driver that can consistently win races, there was always going to be points in the season where tensions were high between the 2 drivers. And although Norris had the better overall 2024 season, I don't think there was a period of time where Lando was definitely the fastest driver out on track for 3 or 4 races in a row. Whereas Piastri, probably between Silverstone and Singapore, was arguably the most informed driver of the entire grid, and of course that led to him scoring the most points of anybody during that time. So I do think if the McLaren car is quickest once again, there'll be a real battle between Lando and Oscar for dominance this season, to the extent that they could be the 2 drivers going for the championship. And we saw the last time that McLaren had 2 drivers going for the championship, way back when it was Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso, that it was a Ferrari that came out on top. McLaren need to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself here and suddenly Charles Leclerc or Lewis Hamilton sneaks in to win a title. Although having said all of that, I actually think the McLaren team have a slightly different thing that it needs to address first and foremost, and that's the fact that they often start slow, actually in 2 different ways. In both 2023 and 2024, coming into the first few rounds of the season, the team hadn't quite got the car where they wanted it to be, and it was always an upgrade sort of 5 or 6 races into the season, which then clicked and jumped them up the standings. In 2024, Max Verstappen basically won the championship in the first 6 rounds because McLaren, Mercedes, and to an extent Ferrari just weren't ready for the season in the way that they were. Had Norris won in Australia rather than Carlos Sainz and maybe been closer to winning the race in Saudi Arabia or Japan, the title fight would have truly been on, rather than the half-hearted, well, it might happen if Max has something go wrong kind of title fight that we got in 2024. But then when the car was really in the swing of things and we started to see Lando pick up pole positions, he then fell victim to the fact that the McLaren car starts slow in the races as well. The amount of times we saw Lando Norris lose positions at the start of Grand Prix was so frustrating. And it's actually something that Max Verstappen and Red Bull put real focus on a few seasons ago. And I think McLaren are now starting to realize that they're in a position where they need to do the same thing. So I think McLaren's New Year's resolution needs to be sorting out these slow starts. They can't afford to have a slow start to the season again. They need to come out in Australia, the first round of the season, and put down a marker for the rest of the grid. And then they need to address their slow starts in the races to make sure that when they're in a position and they qualify well, they don't lose a few positions down to turn one, because it just makes the whole race so much more difficult to manage. Although it's not just the teams, but also the drivers that need to improve as the season progresses. And I talk about where I think all of the drivers will finish in the Drivers' Championship in this video here. So click that link and I'll see you over there.